I worked at a nightclub out in Youngstown, Ohio. I was 19. I was 19 years old, right? And I didn't know about them.
Pryor asked or requested, was looking for someone to pretty much put a hit on Paul for $1 million.
And now this is how ignorant I was. I had a cap. You know them blank starter. I busted into the office with this mother. All right, give me the money, mother.
Then when Richard heard about it, he took Mooney and Spoon, and he made them come to the main room at the Comedy Store the next night and after hours and apologized to me.
In 2017, Rolling Stone named Richard Pryor, the man Jerry Seinfeld once called the Picasso of our profession, the top stand-up comedian in history. Without Pryor's irreverent influence, the comedy world would be a very different place. Yet despite his fame, there are still things you may not know about the comic legend. There are a handful of groundbreaking comedians who changed the rules of the game, and Richard Pryor was one of those comedy iconoclasts.
Hey, wait a minute. Hey, Tony, come here. Wait a minute, Rich, do the gun again. Hey, Tony, come here. Stick up. Ah!
Then the police came. I went in the house. Because they got magnums too. And they don't cars.
He was not the first black stand-up comic since comedians like Bill Cosby, Red Fox, and Dick Gregory came before him. But Pryor was a game-changer whose onstage style would make him the most influential comedian of his generation, especially for black comics such as Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock, and Dave Chappelle. While he was a comedic legend, most didn't realize he was actually one of the most feared comedians of his times, and due to the fact that he was not afraid of anything, other comedians not only respected him, but were also afraid of him. But why was he the most feared comedian of his time when most claimed he was a nice person? Let's get into it. Recently, a past video of Eddie Murphy talking about Richard Pryor has been going viral due to the fact that Eddie claimed the late comedian had asked other comedians to apologize to him, to which they had obliged. Eddie Murphy dropped by late night on Monday to discuss Coming to America, but it was the story that the actor-comedian shared afterward that left host Seth Meyers in hysterics. Following their talk about the new sequel to his 1988 classic, Meyers asked Murphy if it was true that iconic comic Paul Mooney beat him up at the Comedy Store in the 80s. Murphy's classic storytelling took over. Murphy made it clear there was no physical confrontation and explained that there was an incident which started when he was given the light to wrap up his set one evening at the store. I was like first year SNL and I was like, I was only up for 10 minutes, Murphy said. He was told Mooney was up next, and not knowing who that was at the time, Murphy asked the audience which of the two they would rather hear, and when they cheered for him, he kept going for another hour. Right after he walked off the stage, the late great John Witherspoon told him next time he had better get off the stage when the light goes on. I said, F you, and he said, F you, and your mama too, the actor recounted to Meyers. Murphy, who was with director John Landis, then went outside, where he was approached by Mooney, who wanted to hear a part of his set, Murphy recalled. I said, I'm not doing my routine in a parking lot, and he said, F you and F you too, white man. If I had a gun, I'd shoot the both of you. Both Murphy and Meyers were cracking up at that point, but the story was not over since Murphy claimed Richard asked the two to apologize to him. The world of comedy as a whole doesn't really possess the word apology, and so the public claimed these comedians must have been super terrified of Richard for them to apologize.
Richard made them apologize. He was like, hey, you guys are just being mean to that kid because he's a new hot and y'all was jealous and that y'all apologized. And Richard made them apologize.
A video then popped up of Pryor's bodyguard, Rashan Khan, claiming that Richard had put a hit on Paul Mooney for violating his son. According to Rashan, if Richard had not set himself on fire, he would have made sure to end Paul's life for not only disrespecting him, but also for his son.
Of course.
To what extent?
To the extent of Richard didn't want him on the planet no more. He shared it with me and he said he wanted somebody.
Richard's behavior began to intensify in its destructiveness after he set himself up on fire. His consumption of knew no limits. He was racked with anger, emotional pain, and insecurity. demons from his youth that wouldn't leave him no matter how rich and famous he got. On stage, he was lionized. On screen, he was adored. But in life, he continued to lash out at those around him. He beat up his wives and girlfriends and deliberately sabotaged professional engagements. Filming Paul Schrader's Blue Collar 1977, he had fistfights with members of the cast and waved a loaded gun around in front of the director. But how did a man accustomed to telling jokes for a living end up being sad and lonely? Was it his upbringing? Was it the fame? Or was it both? Emmy Award winner Marina Zenovich set out on a journey in 2013 to write a documentary on Richard Pryor in hopes of telling the story of the man who used his pains to put a smile on his audience. She told BBC, "He broke the barriers about talking about race and when you hear him do those routines, they are making it easier for people of different races to talk to each other and laugh with each other. It was groundbreaking." Richard Franklin Lennox, Thomas Pryor III, born December 1st, 1940, came from a city called Peoria, a city so crime-ridden that it was perhaps America's most unchecked sin city. As anybody who's heard his stand-up routines about his childhood knows, the home Pryor grew up in wasn't exactly child-friendly. The comedian was raised in a house, with his mother a night worker, his father a pimp, and his grandmother the madam who owned a total of 3 brothels. His family also owned a tavern and a pool hall and did bootlegging too. Richard once said, "I saw my mother turn tricks for some drunk white man when I was a kid. I saw my father take the money and I saw what it did to them." He even hinted at the fact that one of the men his mother slept with for money was Peoria's mayor. Growing up, Richard saw his father severely beat his mother when he was young before she finally left when he was 5. His mother was rough with him as well. Yet Pryor said that it could have been worse. "At least Gertrude, his mother, didn't flush me down the toilet," he said. To him, this wasn't just a comic riff since he once found a dead baby in a box in the house. If growing up in such conditions wasn't enough dysfunction in Pryor's life, he also was violated multiple times. First by a teenage boy he referred to as Bubba when he was 6. For a long time, Pryor told People magazine, "I tried not to think of it." In the 1980s, Bubba approached him at an autograph session when the comedian returned to Peoria. "I went out and signed an autograph for Bubba's son," Pryor explained to People. "But when Bubba left, I said to myself, I pray to God his son don't have to go through what I did." There were also alleged rumors that claimed that a Catholic priest him. As the New York Daily News put it, his dad and uncle plotted to the priest by encouraging young Richard to flirt with the Reverend on the phone. But Pryor's grandma put an end to that charade. Despite these horrifying circumstances, Pryor did discover something else in his childhood, the ability to make others laugh. When he was in the 6th grade, he was late to school a lot, until his teacher made a deal with him. If he showed up on time, he'd get 10 minutes once a week to perform slapstick routines in front of his classmates. It was his first audience, and it made him want to show up to school on time. Decades later, Peoria would remember that talent by erecting a statue to honor him. Marina's film started in the 1960s when Pryor was all set for mainstream success until he realized one night on stage in Las Vegas that he was not being true to himself. In his early stand-up routines in the early 1960s, Richard Pryor wasn't the profane, irreverent comedian he is remembered as, but rather he sounded more like Bill Cosby, which was intentional on his part. He once told the New York Times that he made a lot of money being Bill Cosby, but didn't enjoy it since he was hiding his personality. He said, "I just wanted to be in show business so bad I didn't care how. It started bothering me. I was being a robot comic, repeating the same lines, getting the same laughs for the same jokes. The repetition was me." Mark Whitaker, Cosby's biographer, said, "If you go back to really early Richard Pryor, he's looking preppy and talking about childhood, and there are a lot of the same sort of mannerisms and so forth as Bill Cosby." According to Whitaker, Bill Cosby asked his manager to tell Pryor a few years later to knock it off and just be himself, and this was a turning point for Richard, who decided to let go of his Cosby act and embrace himself. Cosby later went to see Pryor perform. "I was in the audience when Richard took on a whole new persona, his own," Cosby said. "Richard the Bill Cosby in his act, made people hate it. Then he worked on them, doing pure Pryor, and it was the most astonishing metamorphosis I have ever seen. He was magnificent." Richard Pryor changed from the observational, Cosby-like comedy he started out with to the edgy style he was remembered for after an infamous show at the Aladdin in Las Vegas in 1967. He spotted Dean Martin in the audience, spawning an existential crisis in him, causing him to walk off the stage. Richard Pryor spent a few years finding himself, doing experiments experimental comedy and recording more edgy albums, and talking about his real childhood instead of the sanitized version he'd been peddling. He even went to Berkeley and hung out in the counterculture for a while. He set out on his own path, not anybody else's. I saw myself as a victim of the system, an outsider for whom justice was out of reach, a dream, he wrote in his memoir, and then I saw how closely my situation mirrored the black man's larger struggle for dignity and equality and justice in white society. That was me. I was that character. His delivery, littered with the N-word, hit a nerve with black audiences and with those who caught his act through his hugely popular live albums. After Pryor's death in 2005, British comedian Lenny Henry told the BBC, "I started listening to him in 1977 when a guy in a record shop had this album called That Crazy. He showed it to me and I was going to punch him, but he said, 'Listen to it, that guy's really funny.' Apart from the use of the word apart from the prodigious swearing, I thought, this guy's a genius. He documented every pain, every abuse he'd ever suffered in his life, and he made it funny." Richard Pryor changed in 1979 when he visited Africa for the first time. When he returned to the US from Kenya, he vowed never to use the N-word again. Zenovich said, "Imagine what that moment was like for him. No one knew who he was. It was like going back to your land." He decided to stop using the N-word. He had this epiphany. The film tells how he would joke about his life, his marriages, his relationship with even about having a heart attack. But the quips on the surface masked a sensitivity that led to him self-medicating with and Actor Stan Shaw, who starred with him in Harlem Nights, claimed, "Success doesn't change you, it just magnifies who you are." Pryor's friend and producer David Banks said the comedian had about 13 personalities, and while you could deal with 9 of them, the other 4 were a nightmare. Michael Schultz, who directed Pryor in the film Which Way Is Up, says, "His sensitivity made him so brilliant as a comedian, but some things were so painful that he wanted to be somewhere else." The 1970s were a glorious time in daytime television when mainstream talk shows sometimes featured the counterculture. It's where housewives learned what was happening outside their white bread world. That's how somebody like Richard Pryor could go on Dinah Shore's show in 1974 and talk about the title of his then new comedy album, That N Is Crazy. Mike Douglas had Richard Pryor on his show with Sly Stone in 1974, with Pryor playing the drums with the funk musician. And in 1977, Johnny Carson hosted The Comedian and Chevy Chase, with Pryor making it clear he couldn't stand the former Saturday Night Live star. "I don't like Chevy," he said. There was the same edge between the two as in that infamous SNL word association skit, but for real this time. One of the most mind-blowing episodes of TV ever is seeing Richard Pryor and Louis Gossett Jr. on the goofy music show The Partridge Family. Come on, get happy indeed. The 1971 episode Soul Club was even named one of the top 100 TV episodes of all time. In the plot, the band accidentally got booked in a Detroit club while the Temptations were sent to Phoenix, and the usual hilarity ensues. Or at least hilarity by the sitcom standards of the day. For many years, Richard Pryor seemed to subsist on what was described in The New Yorker as and Courvoisier, and to him it wasn't something he hid or made a secret, since he would talk about his rich lifestyle during his stand-up routines. He was once interviewed in 1980 on the set of Stir Crazy, obviously as high as a kite, and he even claimed in his memoir that Jackie Gleason asked him to get some grass. He also did with whoever asked him to, and would even offer some to those around him. While Pryor was riding high in more ways than one in the 1970s, with great career successes, he lost out on one big role. Black Bart, the sheriff in Mel Brooks's 1974 hit comedy Blazing Saddles. Brooks hired him to help write the film and desperately wanted him to play the part, but Pryor's destroyed that since it was claimed that on his first day in the writer's room for the movie, he broke out his stash of coke, snorted, and invited the others to share. Brooks said the use kept him from hiring Brooks to act in the movie. Warner Bros. Said, "No, he has a we've done some research. We can't get insurance on Richard Pryor, blah blah blah." Brooks threatened to quit the film, but Pryor talked him out of it. While he didn't get the part, Pryor had a hand in the ultimate casting of Cleavon Little for the role. Richard really picked him, Brooks shared. He said, "Look at that guy. He is really black. He would scare the S* out of the entire West." Blazing Saddles is a classic movie, but it's interesting to wonder what Pryor would have been like in that role. Despite Richard Pryor's career success in the late 1970s, he wasn't in a good way, especially after his grandmother Marie died in 1970. 1978, Scott Saul, author of Becoming Richard Pryor, wrote that this passing had shattered his sense of himself and he fell into a profound depression. His world contracted into a black hole dominated by his freebase pipe, his paranoia, and his loneliness. In 1980, Pryor suffered severe burns and nearly died after setting himself on fire. Richard would have died on June 9, 1980, early in the evening, out of his mind on crack. The comedian covered himself in rum and set it alight. Before his guests could rescue him, he jumped out of the window of his house in Northridge, California, and ran down Parthenia Street in a ball of flames. Ignoring pleas from passersby, he staggered around the San Fernando Valley suburb for several minutes while his clothes melted into his skin and the flesh on his upper body bubbled and blistered like meat in a wok. Eventually, 2 cops managed to stop him long enough for an ambulance to arrive. Pryor was then taken to Sherman Oaks Hospital, where it was generally thought, at least by his family and business associates, he'd be spending his last few hours alive. Obituaries were prepared. Unsympathetic acquaintances and certain family members started eyeing up his possessions. Indeed, some things were taken from his house in those first critical hours. People wrote at the time, Los Angeles police say he was burned by an explosion while freebasing. The publication said that Pryor's lawyer had denied the report, claiming the injuries were caused by burning rum. The attorney was technically right in that burning rum caused Pryor's injuries. But as Pryor's biographer Saul notes, on June 9, 1980, Pryor doused himself with a bottle of 151 proof rum and set himself on fire. Not by accident, as he first claimed, but by choice. He had lost the will to live. Ironically, setting himself on fire revived it. That's how messed up Pryor's life was. The idea of him burning himself freebasing was more palatable than what really happened. According to the 2013 Showtime special Richard Pryor, Omit the Logic, Pryor had just been watching a scene on TV about the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire to protest the war in Vietnam. It didn't help that he was wearing a polyester shirt, as it melted to his skin. His life was never the same again. Richard Pryor married 7 times twice to the 2 of 5 women, and he also had untold affairs and relationships with women, including one with actress Pam Grier, his love interest in the 1977 film Greased Lightning. She wrote in her memoir that he did so much that the accumulated in her woman area. While Pryor had a lot of good qualities, he was still fighting the demons of his childhood and was prone to fits of rage. That, combined with the and drinking, wasn't exactly a good match. The New Yorker reported that Pryor regularly beat up women. He also had a thing for guns, shooting up both a car and a fish tank. His ex-wife, Jennifer Lee Pryor, was interviewed in 1986 in People magazine, where she called Pryor out as an abuser, claiming that Pryor had told her he watched his father beat the women in his life as if he owned them and had a right to hit them, and that he did the same to her. You told me it was that macho myth that made you think beating up women was the way to be a big, strong man. I know, I have the bruises and the hospital records to prove it. Despite everything, she still ultimately remarried Pryor and remained with him until his death in the mid-1980s. After Richard Pryor had quit, he started mysteriously losing weight and looking frail, which caused rumors to swirl around him that he had AIDS. Turns out it was multiple sclerosis, which developed in him when he was 46. For the next 2 decades of his life, he would battle the disorder. He described it in People magazine in 1995 as hell. The magazine said, but it is, he believes, a hell of his own creation. Payback for living on the edge. Eventually, Pryor would lose the ability to walk and even to speak from MS. He only was able to do a few acting roles over the years, like a 1995 performance on Chicago Hope, but making people laugh meant everything to him. "It's the only thing in my life that's never hurt me," is what Pryor once said about comedy. "That's given me fulfillment and let me have my dignity, never belittled me." He kept on trying to laugh through the pain of multiple sclerosis until his death in 2005. Richard Pryor wasn't only one of the most influential entertainers in the world for the better part of 3 decades in the mid-20th century, but he was also one of the most wildly successful. According to the numbers, his films made more than $800 million at the box office. For his role as comic relief/accidental villain Gus Gorman, Pryor earned $4 million, making him one of the highest-paid movie stars in history to that point. point, according to the New York Times. All those record royalties and residual payments on movies he starred in or co-wrote meant the money kept coming in for Pryor after he retired from performing and even following his death. According to Celebrity Net Worth, Pryor left behind an estate worth $40 million when he died in 2005. According to Forbes, Jennifer Lee Pryor was left fully in charge of her husband's finances and legacy. She was named the primary beneficiary of the comedian's estate, as well as the executor of his image and intellectual property. That appointment was a late-breaking addition to Pryor's will and trust, and Elizabeth Rain and Richard Pryor Jr. filed suit against Lee Pryor, which included accusations of elder abuse, exploitation, and financial malfeasance. Lee Pryor came out victorious in the legal battles. For her documentary, Zenovich dug out some footage of Pryor being asked how he wanted to be remembered after he died. In a rare moment of straight-faced candor, he said, "I'd like the people to see my picture and laugh and have stories to tell some lies on me, just to bring joy." What's your take on Richard Pryor and his influence in the comedy industry? Tell us in the comment section. That's it for this video. Bye.